Marcus Mariota is done in Atlanta, but more importantly, let's talk about which players on offense are going to shine at this year's scouting combine.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and of course, the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And we thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, it's free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, including YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube, and you will get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. And also check us out on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV by downloading the Locked On Sports Atlanta app. So today, let's talk about the combine, right? We're going to talk about Marcus Mariota officially being released, but the focus of today's episode is going to be about who are going to be the standout players on offense, potentially at this year's scouting combine, which officially began on Tuesday, but the workouts, I believe, begin on Thursday, if I'm not mistaken, or Friday, if I'm not mistaken. But before we get to all that, let's talk about why the combine matters, right? And depending on who you talk to, someone will tell you the combine is underrated or the combine is overrated. And both are probably correct. But let's listen to what Terry Fontenot had to say about it when he spoke to the media on Tuesday morning, and he talked about why he sees the combine as important for two main reasons, which is the medicals and the meetings, right? And the medicals is really the reason behind why the combine started, so that NFL teams can combine, their medical treatments of these guys, so that you can get one physical in one place, as opposed to going to 32 different cities and having to get 32 different physicals and whatnot. And of course, the meetings are important, and NFL teams are going to get 45 of these formal meetings, as well as a countless number of informal meetings with all these players. And those formal meetings are going to be up to 18 minutes long. And we know for a team like the Falcons, who, Terry Fontenot always emphasizes getting the players with the right makeup, those meetings are definitely going to matter. Right? Getting one-on-one with these players is important, right? Now, it's one of many sessions that the teams like the Falcons and in the NFL will have with these players throughout this pre-draft process. But the combine specifically is important, and Terry noted this today, which is it's kind of the first opportunity that the coaches can meet and interact with these players, and it could form a considerable first impression. But all that stuff occurs behind closed doors, and I think that's a big reason why the workouts and the drills probably get a little bit overemphasized by fans and people in the media, because that's not behind closed doors, right? But Terry noted that those things also matter. The workouts matter because of it allows teams to get an apples to apples comparison with today's current players with those of the past, right? And it's going to help fine-tune their evaluation process, because we know, contrary to popular opinion, athleticism does matter in the NFL. And Kentley Platt, who you guys may know as Math Bomb on Twitter, who's famous for his relative athletic score metrics, or RAS, that will, I'm sure, be plastered all across your timelines throughout the next week. But he noted on Monday in a tweet that of the over 1,900 players that are currently on NFL rosters that have posted in RAS, at previous combines or at pro days, 81% of those players were rated a 5.0 or above, meaning that they're 50th percentile, basically average or above average athletes, right? And 45% of those nearly 2,000 players on NFL rosters rated an 8.0 or above, meaning that they're 80th percentile, high-level athletes. And that matters, right? And basically what that's telling us is that in order for players to have staying power in the NFL, to be able to make NFL rosters and continue to make NFL rosters, firmly is attached to athleticism. Athleticism does matter. And I know for me personally, why the combine matters and why it's meaningful is because it helps me find shortcuts in my own player evaluation, right? Like for me, knowing that I want the Falcons to get more explosive on offense, if I see a wide receiver that runs a 4.63, well, I don't necessarily have to rush to watch that guy in the lead up to the draft. He gets put on the back burner. Meanwhile, a wide receiver that may run a 4.43 is probably going to get pushed to the front of at least my own personal queue in this months long pre-draft process. And so I probably tend to be one of those people that will probably overrate the combine. But we'll leave that aside and talk about the rest of today's big news, which is Marcus Mariota being released. And we've known for quite some time that Mariota was going to be cut. The Falcons gained $12 million in salary cap savings by releasing Mariota on Tuesday. We've known Mariota basically since we signed him almost a year ago, that he was a bridge quarterback, and it seemed like he was probably going to be one and done here in Atlanta based off of the structure of his contract. And I think that only got confirmed once he was benched late in the year in favor of Desmond Ridder. And it probably means Mariota is done in Atlanta. It very likely means that he's done in Atlanta, although I still am, probably having the unpopular opinion that I think is possible, unlikely, but possible, that the Falcons may circle back to bringing Mariota back on a cheaper deal at some point this offseason if they strike out at finding sort of the veteran backup quarterback, if that is what they're searching for this offseason. If they don't necessarily land on that type of player. On yesterday's episode, I noted Mitch Trubisky as would be my personal choice for plan A, assuming that he gets released by the Pittsburgh Steelers. Taylor Heineke would probably be my plan B. Chase Daniels, another name worth mentioning. Trubisky and Daniel especially are notable because they worked with Dave Ragone, the Falcons' current offensive coordinator, and also now quarterbacks coach in Chicago. So, I wonder if the Falcons will do that, but we'll see where Mariota winds up. My suspicion is he'll probably land a backup spot somewhere. If I was putting out odds, I don't think FanDuel does the odds yet for Mariota's landing spot, but I would probably put my money on, say, the Eagles, who may be looking to replace Gardner Minshew if he moves on for greener opportunities elsewhere this offseason. So probably done with Marcus Mariota, and we'll see who the Falcons look at for that veteran reserve spot. Probably won't be a rookie, technically, because the rookie is not going to be a veteran reserve, but that's a perfect segue for us to at least start our official combine preview by talking about the quarterbacks. And we know there are 4 big names quarterbacks in this draft that are expected to be first-round picks, potentially top 10 picks. That is Bryce Young of Alabama, C.J. Stroud of Ohio State, Will Levis of Kentucky, and Anthony Richardson of Florida. And the reports already emerged this week that Stroud, Levis, and Richardson are all expected to throw on Saturday during this year's combine workout. Bryce Young will not throw, likely due to the fact that he'll be overweight at the combine this week. And I say that tongue in cheek because there's nothing overweight about Bryce Young, who's expected to measure under 200 pounds, but he's probably going to be drinking a lot of water this week so that he can maximize his weight when he hits the scales in Indianapolis this week, and therefore doesn't necessarily think he's going to put his best foot forward because he's drinking gallons and gallons of water all week long. But I say that because much will be made of Bryce Young's height, but we've seen in recent years that NFL teams do not care nearly as much about, how tall a guy is, evidenced by Kyler Murray going number 1 overall a couple of years ago. But weight does seem to matter, right? We have not seen a sub 200-pound quarterback find much success in the NFL in recent decades. I think Seneca Wallace is the last quarterback that was listed under 200 pounds to be drafted and start a game in the NFL. And that's important because the expectation with Young in particular is that he is a sub 200-pound player. And that's, again, why I think he's going to put on as much weight as he possibly can. And probably whatever he measures in at, you could probably say he's probably 7 to 10 pounds over. Again, this is my guess, 7 to 10 pounds over what his actual playing weight will be in the NFL. So that will be something to keep an eye on, and that will get a lot of attention this week. Anthony Richardson is another player that probably will get a lot of attention this weekend because he, unlike the others, is expected to run this year. And we know that Richardson is a great athlete, and I expect his stock will rise for the reasons I just mentioned, which is everybody, at least in the media, is going to pay attention to these workouts in the 40s. And thus Richardson is going to be able to generate a lot of the buzz, and we'll see if he not only is the talk of the town, at least in the media circles and fan circles, will he be the talk of the town for NFL teams when they meet with him behind closed doors? How will he look on the field when throwing to these different receivers? And the same goes for guys like Stroud and Levis. Can these guys kind of separate themselves, improve their stock, lower their stock, whatever the case may be this weekend based off of those on-field drills? So that's going to be the thing to keep an eye on with the quarterback position. We'll continue today's episode talking about the potential combine standouts at the other skill position players, where we know the 40 is king, but it does give me a chance to talk about some of the other drills and other measurables that matter for the running back and wide receiver position. And we'll get into that as we continue today's episode. But it is beyond the midway point of the NBA season, and it's the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. They have a super safe, secure, and easy to use app. And it's now the perfect opportunity, if you're new to FanDuel, to try it out, because they will give you your no sweat first bet up to $1,000. That means you get bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. It basically means that, you can bet up to $1,000. And if you lose, you get a refund that you can use for future bets. And you can use those future bets on money lines, point spreads, parlays. I love the parlay builder that FanDuel has for the NBA, which means I can select players that will get a certain amount of points, assists, and rebounds as a way to bet a little to win a lot. So make sure you take advantage of your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets back when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So as I said, the combine, when it comes to the combine, the 40 is king, right? Especially for the skill position players. And everybody wants to kind of see, who runs fast, who gets these fast times. And those are going to be the guys, as I mentioned with Anthony Richardson, are going to be the guys that generate the most buzz based off of how fast their 40 is. And the 40 is overrated, but it still does matter, because we know that speed kills in the NFL. And I know, given my desire for wanting to see the Falcons on offense add more speed there, I will probably be paying a lot closer attention to the 40 time than I normally would. And there will be plenty of candidates that will be able to catch my eyes, starting with the running back position. As we talked about on yesterday's episode, my goal is to find a complementary runner to Tyler Algier. And, if Algier is the Thunder, we need to go out there and find the Lightning. So finding that home run hitter at the running back position is certainly something that is near the top of my incentives and to-do list. And when we look at the running backs that are expected to run fast at Indianapolis later this weekend, Devon Achane at Texas A&M, who allegedly has Olympic speed, so he may be one of those guys that could run a sub 4.340 based off of reports. But other guys like Keaton Mitchell out of ECU, Jahmyr Gibbs out of Alabama, Tyjae Spears out of Tulane, Sean Tucker, Syracuse, Israel Banacana from my alma mater, Pitt, and Chase Brown out of Illinois are other guys that are expected to run fast. Another player that I'm very curious to see how fast he runs is not Bijan Robinson, because I'm not expecting him to actually work out at the combine, but his backup in Roschon Johnson at Texas, right? Johnson was on Bruce Feldman's freak list this past year as someone who reportedly clocked over 22 miles per hour in the GPS. And when I watched Johnson on film, he, was a quick guy, seemed like he had like 4 or 5 speed, but that, miles per hour seems to suggest that he's even faster than that. And we've mentioned, I think before, that Johnson does feel like a Falcons type of pick, given his size, his physicality, his quickness. But I've mentioned before that he kind of feels like more of the same with Tyler Algier. He's quicker than Algier and probably more explosive than Algier, but how much quicker, how much more explosive? And so I think, Johnson has a chance, at least for me, to kind of change that narrative, that he can, separate himself and be a different type of runner than what Tyler Algier, if he does run a fast 40. But when it comes to the drills that matter for the running back position, we know that the 40 is really kind of a measure of long speed and top speed. But I think the drills that really matter for running back are the explosiveness drills, right? That when you look at the top, 10 rushers in the NFL this past year, the majority of them tested well in some of the explosive metrics, like the 10-yard split. The first 10 yards of the 40-yard dash, the broad jump, the vertical jump. And I think that's pretty intuitive because you're not going to have too many opportunities where running backs can showcase the type of speed to run 40 yards. You look at over the last 5 years, less than 1%, like half a percentage point of, all runs in the NFL went for over 40 yards, right? Yet 12% went for 10 or more yards. And that basically measures out to, for every 140 plus yard run in the NFL, there are 25 10 plus yard runs. So really that 10 yard split, that first initial explosiveness is going to be much more meaningful for running backs in the NFL. And, we can't talk running backs without giving some love to the fullback position, guys. And I believe that Hunter Lipke out of North Dakota State is the only true fullback that was invited to this year's combine. But from what I understand, the late season injury that he suffered will prevent him from working out. And that's going to be disappointing for me personally as the host of Locked On Fullbacks, is because he was also a Feldman freak this past summer, and there were reports that he would clock a sub 4.640 time, which is something, at least I think according to mockdraftable.com, a fullback has not done at the combine since 2009. So we may miss out on a freakish fullback at this year's combine due to that injury. But let's move on and talk about the wide receivers. And this is going to be a position where the 40 is a little bit more meaningful because we know wide receivers are more inclined to run, longer distances down the field on routes, on deep balls, all that various things. And obviously, I think it matters if you have the speed to run past corners in the NFL. That is certainly advantageous to NFL success. And I won't sit here and say 40 time correlates highly to the overall quality of a receiver, but it certainly does correlate pretty highly to the guys that are going to generate the explosive plays on a regular basis at the next level. And that is something that we hope, or at least I hope, the Falcons can do in the future years. So I think the 40 time is going to matter probably a little bit more for me when it comes to evaluating these receivers. And some of the guys that you guys can check out that are expected to run blazing times, Jalen Hyatt out of Tennessee, Tyler Scott out of Cincinnati, his teammate at Cincinnati, Trey Tucker, Andre Yeshivas at Princeton, and Quentin Johnson out of TCU. And we know that NFL teams are certainly going to covet speed at the position, and it's going to potentially catapult several guys to higher draft spots depending on how fast they run. You used last year Tyquan Thornton out of Baylor, who I think had the fastest 40 anybody. I think for the most part, most people saw him as a day 3 pick, and he wound up going in round 2 to the Patriots last year. And I think, if Hyatt and Scott run as fast as people think they are, sub 4.3 type of 40s, those guys may catapult themselves in the first round. Another guy that I think, deserves is Quentin Johnson out of TCU. Not because he's going to run like a 4.29, although, I wouldn't put it completely past it. But if he does run like a sub 4.40 at his weight, is going to be, a huge thing for him. And that's where we get into the idea of, the weight adjusted 40, right? Like you look at a player like Julio Jones, who ran a 4.34 at 220 pounds. All right, which is, a 4.34 is impressive on its own, but it's even more impressive at 220 pounds comparatively to Aldrick Robinson, who ran like a 4.34 at 184 pounds. And so my prediction right now, sitting here today, is that Johnston, due to running a fast 40, is going to be able to generate a ton of buzz over this weekend, and maybe sort of one of the combine winners should he run as fast as people sort of expect, to the point where I will not be surprised if many of you guys are submitting questions for future Q&As, possibly the Mock Draft Monday mailbag that we do to wrap up this week, where it's like, well, did you see Quentin Johnson? Should the Falcons, Aaron, you want more speed at the position. Should the Falcons consider Quentin Johnson at 8? And my answer is going to be no to that question, by the way, so you don't necessarily need to ask it. But, for me, as I said, the 40 is going to be meaningful for my evaluation of these receivers. But, I'm not a huge Quentin Johnson fan. And so, I don't want to see the Falcons go 3 consecutive years drafting pass catchers is what I'll say. So I just want to give you a heads up. The answer is no, even though I'm sure that will be a legitimate question on many of your guys' lips over the next week or so. But I think when we talk about wide receivers and what's worth paying attention to, other drills that matter to me that I pay attention to is the 3-cone and hand size, right? And I'll be curious. I know that the combine kind of reformatted and reshuffled the days when players work out. I don't know if they reshuffled how they work out. I know they're doing the bench press on a different day than the on-field workouts, because last year a whole bunch of players skipped the bench press and all that sort of stuff. So they don't want to do that anymore. But one of the things that's happened over recent years was that the NFL had pushed the 3-cone to the end of the night. And it led, I think, to a lot of players being tired, given these extremely long days where they're like waking up at 4 a.m. and they're not running, the 3-cone until midnight that night. 4 a.m. for their physicals. I was like, what's that P word? The physicals that they're having. And then, running and so it led to a bunch of bad 3-cones over the recent years, where you saw a bunch of guys being like, oh, that guy ran an awful 3-cone time. And I wonder if the part of their process of changing things, did they move that? So it'll be, if they didn't, then the 3-cone probably won't matter nearly as much as it has in, 5-10 years ago when it comes to evaluating receivers. But obviously you can understand why, the 3-cone and short shuttle, these agility drills matter for wide receivers, given, route guys that can win with route running and separation, and you want guys to be able to get in and out of their breaks and all that various things. And the hand size matters, just because there isn't a large history of receivers with small hands succeeding in NFL, right? You want to be able to catch the ball. Although there are exceptions to that, like Hunter Renfrow, Tyler Lockett tend to be on the much smaller in hand size. So I do think it's probably a little less meaningful to like the quote unquote slot receiver types of guys than, guys that are being expected to win on the outside. So those are some things to pay attention to. But as I said, I'll be looking a lot at the 40 for this receiver group. Will I be looking at the 40 for the tight ends? Is it that important for the tight end position, or is there another drill that is meaningful for that position, as well as what is meaningful when we come to the offensive line? And we'll get into that as we continue today's episode. But we're just scratching the surface here on today's Locked On Falcons, your first listen when it comes to these various combine prospects. And if you want to get a deeper dive into these various guys, then you got to check out the Locked On NFL Draft. Subscribe to it wherever you get your podcasts. So when it comes to the tight end position, I think the drill that matters most for it is probably the 3-cone and not the 40 time, right? I look at Mock Draftable and I look at, there are basically, like, I think roughly 50 guys that have run a sub 7-1 3-cone at the tight end position since 2011. And 7 of those guys have made the Pro Bowl. And that doesn't include guys like Mike Gesicki, Dallas Goedert, Dalton Schultz that have put up Pro Bowl caliber numbers in recent years, despite not getting the opportunity to go to that All-Star game. And so, I think the 3-cone is probably a little bit more meaningful for the tight end position than the 40, even though the 40 is still going to get the most buzz at the tight end position because, everybody wants that speed mismatch guy that can run past defenses. But we know it probably doesn't mean as much for the tight end position as it does at wide receiver position, because tight ends are rarely kind of field stretchers. And so therefore I do think the 40 does, while, no one's going to sit here and say having a slow guy is a bad thing in the NFL. It's probably one of those drills that is probably a little bit overrated for the tight end position relative to some of these other positions. But in terms of guys that may wind up running fast 40s, some of the people to keep an eye on at the tight end position is Darnell Washington out of Georgia, Luke Musgrave out of Oregon State, Josh Wiley out of Cincinnati. And with Washington in particular, there are various reports that have come out over the last couple of days that Washington, who's going to measure in at 270 plus pounds, may run a sub 4.7 40. And when you adjust that type of speed, like 4.65 at 270 plus pounds, and you adjust it, that is very similar to a weight adjusted 40 that John Ross ran, the 4.22, the record 40 time at 188 pounds, or Terry McLaurin ran at 208 pounds when he ran a 4.35 type of 40. That's what, Washington is moving in terms of generating force, is the same as what those, very explosive receivers are doing if he's able to clock that sub 4.740 at 270 plus pounds. And so once again, just like Jordan Davis, Trayvon Walker, and Devontae Wyatt were among the best players at last year's combine when it came to weight adjusted 40 times, we may have a couple of Georgia guys that are also at the top of this year's group, including Darnell Washington, as well as Broderick Jones, who may be heading up the offensive tackle group. And I'm very curious to keep tabs on this offensive line group to see who are the premier athletes, especially at the offensive tackle position. Guys like Broderick Jones out of Georgia, Jalen Duncan out of Maryland, Paris Johnson out of Ohio State, Blake Freeland out of BYU, Anton Harrison out of Oklahoma, guys that I expect to test well at this combine. And do they live up to that? And that's going to matter for the Falcons, especially in a world where they may potentially move on from Kaleb McGary, which is something I outlined on yesterday's episode, where I went through and put on my GM hat to be the Falcons general manager. And basically, with me being the decision maker as opposed to Terry Fontenot, I decided to move on from Kaleb McGary because I feel like I can get one of these plus athletes in the draft. I'm also curious to see some of the guys that I have more question marks about their athleticism, like Northwestern Peter Skoronski. Is he a high-end athlete? And so he'll get a chance to prove that at this year's combine. There's a couple other names that were on Bruce Feldman's freak list over the summer that, are worth noting. Joe Littman, the center out of Wisconsin, McClendon Curtis, the offensive lineman out of Chattanooga, and Andrew Voorhees, the guard out of USC, who was on that freak list because of his bench press numbers. And speaking of the bench press is probably the drill that is the most inconsequential and complete waste of time at the combine, regardless of position. It gets a lot of attention, particularly with the offensive line, but it is basically meaningless. There's really nothing to glean from it. And the most prominent example that I'm sure will hit home for a lot of you guys that I will use to illustrate this point is Vic Beasley. Like when you watch Vic Beasley at Clemson, one of the big question marks I had about Vic Beasley watching the film was he lacks core strength. But then he comes to the combine and puts up 35 bench reps, which is not only elite numbers for an edge rusher, it was 97th percentile of any position at the combine in NFL history, right? And yet that did not translate on the field, as you saw. And so, basically what the bench press to me tells me has nothing to do with what happens on the field. It's all off the field. It's basically telling me that, this player has not skipped his workouts in college and in high school. And you also see a strong correlation between the guys that put up great bench press numbers and arm length, right? The longer arm guys tend to do poor on the bench press because they have to move the bar further than the shorter arm guys. So a lot of these short arm guys can put up a lot of bench press reps. And so I will say, do not pay any attention to the bench press, not only for the offensive line, for any position group. It is a complete waste of time to even factor that into any equation that you are looking at. So I want to give you that heads up. Now, when it comes to what you should be paying attention for the offensive line, some of these agility drills I think are meaningful. I know Josh Norris of Underdog Fantasy is always putting out the short shuttle. And if you clock a short shuttle, like I think it's sub 4.47, I've seen like sub 4.55, somewhere around that range. It does correlate highly to at least guys that tend to go on to start in the NFL, that tend to get drafted in the NFL, all that and more. So, I think with the Falcons operating an outside zone scheme, athleticism is going to be much more meaningful for the Falcons in their part of their evaluation. Part of the reason why, the last two drafts where they drafted guys like Jalen Mayfield and Justin Schaefer, I've kind of poo-pooed those draft picks because they weren't, it's one thing to bet on, projects like those guys were, but at least bet on a project that is a plus athlete. It doesn't make a ton of sense to bet on a project if he's not a plus athlete, especially given the Falcon scheme. And I think the agilities, like the 3-cone, like the short shuttle, the explosiveness metrics, the 10-yard split out of the 40, the broad jumps, the vertical jumps are going to be very meaningful for me as part of that evaluation to see who are the high-end athletes. But I do think the 40, I won't say the 40 matters for offensive linemen, but it does correlate highly to the good athletes, right? And a fast 40 for an offensive lineman is typically like sub 5.25, as opposed to, the other position where we're all focused on the 4.4 guys. And again, it's not because you expect an offensive lineman to ever run 40 yards down the field or it's particularly meaningful. But typically, if you're that fast, again, 5'1" type 40 guy, it usually correlates to you being a good athlete and being, athletic and agile and explosive in other metrics, right? That, for the outside zone scheme, you need that lateral agility. You need that explosiveness out of your stance in order to make those reach blocks, in order to climb to the second level and take out those linebackers, which is critical in this type of blocking scheme. And when you have a 300+ pound guy that is able to move at a high rate, with these 40 times, it's rare that you're going to find a guy that tests well in the 40, but also tests poorly in some of these other areas like the 10-yard split, like the short shuttle, all that various stuff, right? So while, again, I don't think the 40 matters, it is often indicative of the guys that have the plus athleticism that you're looking for along the offensive line. So that is going to do it for us, Guy, in our offensive combine preview. Just trying to give you an overview of some of the names to know, some of the drills that you're going to pay attention to. But of course, the real decisions are made behind closed doors, where Terry Fontenot and Arthur Smith and all those guys are meeting with those players, and we'll be able to circle back in April and be like, oh yes, they like that guy. Oh yeah, he ran a good 40, or he had a good 3-cone or whatever, but it was really the makeup that pushed him up on the Falcons board. So we'll see how that goes. One of my takeaways in preparing for this episode, watching, sort of skimming through more running backs and tight ends and receivers in recent days, was the deeper I go in this draft, the deeper I see this draft class being at those specific positions, where, again, wanting to see the Falcons add some more explosiveness at those skill positions this offseason. I know it's not necessarily the biggest priority for the team. They have quarterback questions that they need to answer. They certainly need to improve the defense, and we'll talk all about some of the specific players that can improve that tomorrow on our defensive combine preview. But the deeper I go at the skill positions, I do feel like the Falcons will have an opportunity to get some, dynamic, explosive players that can add some of that, in round 3, in round 4, somewhere along those lines in this year's draft at a number of those offensive skill positions. So, if you find yourself standing somebody, that runs a 4.4 40 this weekend, by all means, live your life how you want to live it. It's not the end all be all when it comes to these draft prospects, but certainly I think you can make a case for why some of this stuff matters, probably a little bit more than you will hear from other, people that are always poo-pooing the combine, saying, oh, none of this stuff matters. It matters. It just depends on who you ask and who you talk to, how much it matters. So as I said earlier, tomorrow we'll get into the defensive players. We'll probably be revisiting why the 3-cone is meaningful for the edge rushers, why arm length is important for where and when cornerbacks are going to get drafted, probably get into more specific individual players and take a deeper look at some of these guys and how they may test, just because of our current expectation that the Falcons will lean towards the defensive side of the ball at that 8th overall selection, and talk about how the combine may help or hurt guys that may or may not be on their radar with that draft selection. But that's all on tomorrow's episode. Make sure Locked On Falcons remains your first listen, guys. And of course, check out Locked On NFL Draft for your second listen, where you're getting the lowdown from hosts Keith Sanchez and Damian Parson of the Draft Network, breaking down not only all the combine standouts, the combine lowlights or non-standouts, whatever the opposite of the laydowns. What is that? Lay-ins, standout, lay-in, sit-ins. What, I don't know. Okay. Anyway, check out Locked On NFL Draft for that content, whatever we call it. All part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team, guys, every day.